When we look at the story of Ahqaf, it becomes immediately clear that their destruction did not begin with the storm itself. No, civilization collapses in a single moment. The wind that finally tore them apart was only the physical manifestation of a spiritual decay that had been growing inside them for years, perhaps generations. And that is the part we often overlook. We focus on the dramatic end, the fury of the wind, the force that uprooted their homes and erased their identity. But we rarely reflect on the quiet decline that paved the way for that ending. Their downfall began the day they allowed arrogance to overshadow gratitude, and entitlement to replace humility. What happens to a nation when blessings become so normal that they are no longer recognized as blessings? When prosperity becomes a birthright instead of a gift? This is the psychological shift that destroys societies long before any catastrophe arrives. The people of Ahqaf were known for their strength and their remarkable physical presence. Quran itself hints at their towering stature, their ability to carve structures into mountains, their power that exceeded anything the region had seen. But power is only dangerous when it blinds you, and that is exactly what happened. They became so accustomed to their dominance that they genuinely believed they were untouchable. You see, moral decline rarely comes through intentional rebellion. It comes slowly, silently, almost imperceptibly. People begin to justify small wrongs, excuse small deviations, ignore small signs. A little arrogance becomes normal. A little disobedience becomes acceptable. A little corruption becomes inevitable. And before long, the moral compass is no longer broken. It is forgotten. This is exactly what unfolded in Ahqaf. Their hearts hardened, not overnight, but over a slow erosion of values. They stopped listening to warnings because they believed they had outgrown them. They stopped acknowledging blessings because they believed they had earned them. They stopped fearing consequences because they believed consequences were for the weak. And that is the profound psychological lesson here. Destruction begins from the inside. Before the wind uprooted their buildings, moral decay had already uprooted their conscience. Before the storm shredded their bodies, arrogance had already shredded their humility. The external collapse was simply the mirror image of an internal collapse. Think about how civilizations rise. They rise through discipline, unity, gratitude, humility, and a deep sense of purpose. But they fall for the exact opposite reasons. It is not the loss of resources that destroys a nation. It is the loss of character. It is not enemies from outside. It is emptiness from within. When integrity disappears, strength becomes meaningless. When humility disappears, success becomes poisonous. When gratitude disappears, blessings become traps. Ahqaf had every material advantage, but without moral grounding, those advantages worked against them. This is why the Quranic narrative is not just a historical record. It is a psychological warning. Anyone, an individual, a family, a community, an entire nation, can begin to decay the moment arrogance replaces humility. When people start believing they deserve blessings rather than being entrusted with them, when they prioritize pride over principles, when they silence their conscience long enough for it to stop speaking. The story of Ahqaf is not meant to make us fear the wind. It is meant to make us fear the gradual decline that invites it. It is meant to remind us that every blessing becomes a test the moment we disconnect it from gratitude. Their destruction began with a mindset, not a storm. And if we wish to protect ourselves, our families, our society, then we must begin by protecting that mindset. Because the real collapse always happens long before anyone notices it. The fall of Ahqaf teaches one truth. A heart that loses humility is already halfway to destruction. When we talk about warnings, especially divine warnings, many people imagine something dramatic: thunder, lightning, miracles unfolding in the sky. But the truth is far more subtle. Warnings rarely arrive in spectacular form. They come quietly, repeatedly, patiently, through voices we often dismiss and signs we convince ourselves are coincidences. The people of Ahqaf were not destroyed without being told, again and again, that their path would lead them to ruin. But what makes their story so tragic is not the punishment they faced. It is the warnings they ignored. Think for a moment about how guidance works. It never forces itself on you. It appeals to your conscience. It taps on the heart, not the door. It gives you space, time, and countless opportunities to wake up. The people of Ahqaf had a prophet among them, a man who lived with them, who knew their struggles, who spoke their language, who understood their culture. He wasn't a stranger preaching from afar. He was one of their own, and yet they dismissed him. They brushed off his message as exaggeration. They framed his warnings as pessimism, as fear, mongering as unnecessary negativity. That pattern is still familiar today. When someone stands up to remind us, to tell us we are drifting, to call us back to humility, our instinct is often to defend ourselves, not to reflect. This is the psychology of denial. People do not reject guidance because they lack understanding. They reject it because accepting it requires change. It requires honesty. It requires vulnerability, and that is uncomfortable. The people of Ahqaf were comfortable, too comfortable. Their prosperity made them believe they had outgrown the need for correction. Their strength made them feel immune to consequences. So, when reminders came, they refused to see them as gifts. They saw them as annoyances, and this is where the danger lies. Warnings are a sign of divine mercy, not divine anger. When Allah warns, it means He is still giving you time. The end is never sudden for those who are willing to listen, but denial creates a psychological barrier. Once people grow used to ignoring small warnings, they begin ignoring larger ones. A troubled conscience is dismissed as stress. A setback is blamed on bad luck. A moment of guilt is buried under distraction, and before long, the ability to recognize guidance becomes lost. Ahqaf reached that point. They ridiculed their prophet. They demanded proof, thinking they were intellectually superior. They accused him of exaggerating fear. It wasn't that they didn't understand his words. They simply didn't want those words to be true. Accepting the warning would mean confronting their own arrogance, and that was something they were unwilling to do. So they dismissed every reminder as unnecessary, irrelevant, or exaggerated. But what they were really rejecting was their final chance at protection. The lesson is not merely historical, it is deeply personal. How many times do we get warnings in our own lives? A friendship falling apart, a habit becoming destructive, a heart growing harder, a prayer delayed, a conscience ignored. These are warnings. Subtle, quiet, gentle. If we don't respond to them, they don't stop. We just stop hearing them, and that is what happened to Ahqaf. Their downfall was sealed not because they sinned, but because they refused to listen when they were called back. In the end, the storm that destroyed them was simply the final consequence of years spent rejecting opportunities to change. Warnings are not meant to frighten us. They are meant to save us. But they only save those who can still hear them. The people of Ahqaf remind us of one truth. When a heart stops listening, even the loudest warning becomes silent. When we speak about the wind that struck the people of Ahqaf, we often imagine an ordinary storm, powerful, yes, but still within the limits of nature as we understand it. But the Quran is deliberate in its language. This was not a normal wind. It was a force designed with precision, targeting a nation that had grown arrogant in its strength and indifferent to its warnings. To understand the magnitude of what happened, you have to look beyond the physical destruction. The real message lies in how quickly human pride collapses when confronted with a power it cannot comprehend. Imagine a people who believed themselves unmatched. Their bodies were strong, their architecture massive, their civilization advanced for its time. They built structures that seemed immovable, pillars that looked eternal. They thought nothing in the natural world could truly threaten them. This confidence was not merely cultural, it was psychological. They had convinced themselves that their physical power was a shield. But power that blinds you is not a shield, it's a trap. Then came the wind, not as rain, not as thunder, not as lightning. Just wind. Something so ordinary, so familiar, so underestimated. But when Allah wishes to remind creation of its limits, He does not need to deploy armies of angels or cosmic events. A single command, carried by something as subtle as air, is enough to dismantle the foundations of an entire civilization. What tore Ahqaf apart was not a storm in the way we understand storms. It was a precise manifestation of divine will, a force that struck exactly where their pride was rooted. This wind lifted their warriors' men built like giants high into the sky and hurled them back to the ground. It uprooted trees they thought invincible. It tore down structures they believed eternal. Within days, a nation that had dismissed every warning was left in silence. The psychological impact of such an event is profound. Everything they believed protected them was revealed to be an illusion. Their strength, their size, their architecture, their resources, none of it mattered. They discovered in the most devastating way that control is not in human hands. And this is where the deeper lesson emerges. Human beings often place their trust in what they can see: wealth, health, influence, physical strength, social status. But these are fragile foundations. When a person or a society anchors itself in material power alone, it becomes vulnerable to the very thing it ignores. Ahqaf trusted the wrong things. They trusted the permanence of their physical capabilities. They trusted the stability of their environment. They trusted the illusion of their own superiority. And so, the very element they never imagined would become a threat ere became the instrument of their destruction. There is something profoundly humbling in that. It forces us to confront how limited our control truly is. It reminds us that the universe operates on laws far greater than human perception. The wind teaches us that the human ego is always one disruption away from collapse. And yet, this is not a message meant to instill fear alone. It's meant to awaken humility. A heart that recognizes its limits becomes a heart that seeks guidance. A person who understands the fragility of their strength becomes someone who relies not on their own power, but on the one who controls all power. The people of Ahqaf learned their lesson too late. Their downfall was not just the result of a physical phenomenon. It was the exposure of a psychological illusion. They believed they were secure until the moment the wind touched them, and that is the essence of their story. A reminder that nothing is truly strong unless it is anchored in humility. The fate of Ahqaf teaches one simple truth. The moment you forget your dependence on the one who controls the winds themselves become your reminder. If there is one irony that stands out in the story of Ahqaf, it is the way their greatest strength became the very thing that blinded them. They were known for their remarkable physical power, their imposing structures, their ability to shape the landscape to their will. Strength was their identity, their pride, their sense of security. But strength without humility does not elevate a nation, it endangers it. What Ahqaf failed to understand is that anything you rely on more than you rely on Allah eventually becomes the reason for your downfall. Their physical bodies were extraordinary, but their moral backbone was weak. Their buildings reached high, but their hearts remained low. Their confidence was immense, but it was not grounded in wisdom. It was grounded in self-worship, and self Worship is the most fragile foundation any human being or civilization can stand on. When a person begins to believe that their abilities are entirely their own, they lose sight of the one who granted those abilities in the first place. When a community becomes intoxicated by its accomplishments, it begins to view humility as weakness. And that is when strength becomes dangerous, because it becomes detached from guidance. You see, the people of Ahqaf didn't just possess strength, they glorified it. They measured worth by physical ability. They equated greatness with power, not with integrity. They believed their bodies could withstand anything. So they convinced themselves that consequences did not apply to them. This psychological arrogance is far more lethal than any external threat. When a person believes they are too strong to fall, they have already begun falling internally. And this mindset did something else. It made them dismissive. When their prophet spoke, they interpreted his humility as inferiority. When he warned them, they saw him as weak, overly cautious, too soft. In their minds, strength was loud, visible, physical. They could not comprehend that true strength lies in character. The strength to admit mistakes, to change direction, to acknowledge truth even when it challenges your pride. So they brushed off every reminder, believing that as long as they had their physical might, they were safe. But physical might is nothing when moral weakness takes hold. This is the paradox society still struggles with today. We admire power, success, influence, and dominance. We celebrate those who appear strong, even if their strength hides inner emptiness. But real strength is measured by stability of the heart, not by the size of the body. It's measured by how responsibly you use what you've been given, not by how loudly you display it. Ahqaf misunderstood this distinction. They built a civilization on the illusion that strength equals invincibility. They assumed that blessings guaranteed permanence. They believed that having more meant being more. And then the wind came, something they never considered a threat. In a matter of days, their strength was revealed for what it truly was, a brittle facade. Their warriors, once feared, were helpless. Their structures, once symbols of might, were scattered like straw. The wind did not simply destroy a nation. It exposed a truth they refused to accept. That strength without humility is the fastest path to collapse. We often pray for strength, success, and prosperity, but we rarely pray for humility. Yet humility is the ingredient that keeps every blessing from becoming a curse. It is the force that grounds strength in gratitude, that turns power into responsibility, that transforms ability into virtue. Ahqaf teaches us that the moment strength becomes a source of arrogance, it becomes a seed of destruction. True strength is not what lifts you above others, it's what keeps you from falling. When we reflect on the story of Ahqaf, it is easy to treat it as a distant historical lesson, a tale of giants, winds, and destruction from a time long past. But the truth is far more immediate and personal. Their downfall was not caused by some extraordinary phenomenon unique to their era. It was the culmination of choices, attitudes, and patterns of behavior that are just as possible today as they were thousands of years ago. The same weaknesses that tore Ahqaf apart, arrogance, ingratitude, moral erosion, and disunity, exist in every society and in every individual who forgets the source of their blessing. The story becomes a mirror for the modern Ummah, for every person who believes they are too secure, too strong, or too prosperous to fall. Ahqaf's fate was sealed not because of the wind, but because of what had already taken root in their hearts. And if we are honest with ourselves, we can see echoes of those same tendencies around us, within us, and in our communities. We live in an age of unprecedented convenience, technological prowess, and wealth. Yet spiritual and moral vulnerabilities have never been more evident. Just as Ahqaf dismissed their prophet's warnings, we often dismiss the guidance that challenges our comfort, our pride, and our assumptions. Disunity was one of the silent killers of their civilization. Strength without cohesion becomes brittle. When people turn inward, chase personal gain, or refuse to listen to the collective conscience, they invite chaos. Today, the Ummah faces a similar test, not in storms of sand and wind, but in the erosion of shared values, the fragmentation of communities, and the temptation to measure success by material standards alone. Ahqaf's example reminds us that no amount of power, no amount of pride, can compensate for the disintegration of moral and spiritual unity. The lesson extends further. Arrogance blinds the mind, making it incapable of recognizing reality until it is too late. The people of Ahqaf believed their strength made them untouchable. They believed their size, their resources, and their fortifications were more important than conscience, humility, or submission to divine guidance. Today, we often place similar trust in our wealth, knowledge, influence, or technological advancement. We assume that these external markers of security will protect us from consequences, but history and the Quran repeatedly warns that the collapse of the heart precedes the collapse of the nation. There is also a deeply personal dimension to this lesson. Every individual faces winds of fury in some form, tests of character, moments of temptation, trials of faith. Just as Ahqaf was warned, we are warned in subtle ways, through conscience, scripture, and the wisdom of those who guide us. Ignoring these warnings, dismissing them as inconvenient or irrelevant, is how decline begins. The collapse of a society often mirrors the collapse of its individuals. Small failures repeated over time, moral compromises accepted as norms, and the gradual loss of perspective. Yet the story of Ahqaf is not meant to leave us paralyzed with fear. It is meant to awaken responsibility and awareness. It challenges us to ask ourselves, where are we ignoring warnings in our lives? Where have we allowed pride, disunity, or arrogance to blind us? How can we strengthen ourselves morally and spiritually before external consequences arrive? The same principles that could have saved Ahqaf, humility, gratitude, cohesion, and moral vigilance, can protect us today. Ahqaf teaches one enduring truth for the modern Ummah. The seeds of destruction are always within reach, and the moment to change is always now. Waiting until the storm arrives is too late. Recognizing the signs, listening to guidance, and correcting our course is how we survive, thrive, and honor the blessings we have been entrusted with. The story of Ahqaf is a mirror, a warning, and a call to action. Reflect deeply, act humbly, and unite sincerely, because ignoring the lessons of the past is how history repeats itself. If there is one lesson that gives the story of Ahqaf its enduring relevance, it is this: destruction is never the ultimate goal, transformation always is. The wind of fury that struck Ahqaf was devastating, but it was not arbitrary cruelty. It was the final stage of a process that began with moral neglect. And embedded within that process is a profound message of hope for those who are willing to heed it. Just as the same Creator who allowed the wind to strike is the source of all mercy, guidance, and restoration, there is always a path back for those who turn sincerely toward Him. What does it mean to find hope in the midst of warnings? It means recognizing that the very signs meant to terrify us are also opportunities to reflect, correct our course, and rebuild. Ahqaf's people ignored their warnings, but the Quran emphasizes repeatedly that divine guidance is always extended to those who will listen. Mercy is never exhausted. The door to transformation remains open until it is too late. This is a principle that applies not only to nations, but to families, communities, and individuals. Our trials are not necessarily punishments. They are invitations to growth, to awakening, to reconnecting with what matters most. Consider the psychological dimension of this. Human beings are prone to despair when confronted with failure, loss, or warning. We see our mistakes, our weaknesses, our lapses, and we begin to think that change is impossible. But the story of Ahqaf teaches that it is not the severity of the warning that defines our future. It is our response to it. The same force that can destroy can also illuminate if we allow it. The wind that tore Ahqaf apart was a consequence of their arrogance, but it is also a reminder that awareness and humility can redirect the course of our lives before such consequences arrive. Transformation begins with the recognition of vulnerability. It begins with honesty with oneself, with one's conscience, and with the Creator. A person, a community, or a nation must admit that they are not infallible, that their strength is limited, and that reliance on anything other than divine guidance is ultimately fragile. This is not a call to despair, but a call to empowerment. When we acknowledge our dependence on Allah, we open the door for real strength, the kind of strength that is resilient because it is anchored in humility and wisdom. It also begins with action. Reflection without change is empty. Recognizing the signs and the warnings must be followed by concrete steps. Reforming character, cultivating gratitude, prioritizing unity, and correcting moral and ethical paths. Ahqaf had the opportunity to change. They failed to act. Today, the lesson is clear. The moment we recognize our own arrogance, pride, or moral drift, we must respond before it manifests as destruction. Every act of sincere correction, no matter how small, aligns us with divine protection and mercy. And finally, hope requires faith in divine justice and mercy. The same power that can destroy is also the power that restores. The Creator who exacts consequence is the Creator who forgives, guides, and rebuilds. For every nation, for every individual, for every community, there is always the potential for renewal if humility and action accompany awareness. The story of Ahqaf is a warning, yes, but it is also a beacon. No matter how far a people or person has drifted, the path to transformation remains open as long as they turn sincerely toward it. The wind of fury tore Ahqaf apart, but it also teaches us a timeless truth. Destruction is avoidable for those who listen, who humble themselves, and who act. The door to redemption is never closed until it is too late. The ultimate message is simple yet profound. The same hand that warns can heal, the same power that destroys can restore, and the same guidance that awakens the conscience can save those willing to respond.